The Oort Perimeter, Chapter 9. The Varnock prophet strode slowly into the middle of a large stone patio and paused. Around him stood tall, ornate pillars of ghost white marble carved into shapes highly reminiscent of ancient Roman designs. Nearby, a man in a long, flowing black hood and cloak stood at the far end of the patio near a trickling pool of water and stared at it as he stood with his back to the prophet. Evidence of an ornate sword and dagger peeked out from the edges of his cloak. Several men in leather uniforms similar to those worn by Roman centurions stood guard along the perimeter. "What is it?" asked the hooded man with a hint of annoyance. The prophet took a deep breath, and said, "The Syrians that you sent to the Chapagi have failed their mission and were sent away in disgrace." The hooded man continued to stare at the pool of water, but said nothing. "Master, the Syrians failed to complete their mission. There is also evidence that enemy saboteurs slipped aboard their ship and rendered their equipment useless." The hooded man stood quietly for several more moments before speaking up. "Have the Syrians been paid?" he asked. "They have. But I do not think it was wise to do so. Their mission was a failure. Tangible results are not necessary in order to achieve success," said the man. The prophet tilted his head curiously. "What are you saying? We got nothing for the bargain." The man turned and glared at the prophet from under his hood. "You are a prophet, and yet you cannot see what has been gained from this transaction," said the man. The prophet shook his head as he twitched nervously. The man sighed heavily. "Is your brain filled with water, or are you simply that dumb?" he snapped. "I am neither, master," replied the prophet. "Then think. Open your mind to things greater than what you can hold in your hand." The prophet pondered this for a moment, and then furrowed a brow. "The Syrians are merely pawns," he replied. The man gave a gleefully devilish grin. "So you do use your brain for more than a shoulder decoration." "You are correct, but not entirely. When one wishes to move with greatest stealth, it is wise to draw away the eyes of one's enemies first." The prophet perked up slightly. "And the Syrians were the diversion." "Correct. I expected them to fail. That is why your news comes as no surprise to me. It is also why I used them instead of other, more valuable assets." The prophet hacked slightly. "Master, why are the Chapagi of such interest to you?" he asked. "They are yet another pawn among many, a tool by which I will bring down the 9 races, and ultimately the entire galaxy. They are minor and insignificant by themselves. But, as a tool of conquest, they are invaluable." Intrigued, the prophet grinned. "Then you are using the Chapagi to divide the 9 races against themselves." "My plans are far greater than even that. Each one of the 4, who stand against the Chapagi, will fall in order, leaving but 5 to squabble and battle among themselves. In time they too will be destroyed, leaving no one with sufficient strength to stand against us. We will then sweep into the void they leave behind, and conquer it all." The smile faded from the prophet's face. "My race is one of those who will fall," he said with a hint of concern, realizing the dilemma that this new revelation presented. "The time of the 9 races is over. Very soon it will be the Krashens who will rule all. Those who serve us will be rewarded. Those who do not will be destroyed." The prophet's eyes narrowed. "What of my race? Will they be annihilated?" he asked probingly. The man shook his head. "Your strength will be reduced, and the vine of your people trimmed, leaving only the strong and the healthy, but it will not be exterminated. From this gleaning, your race shall rise stronger than it ever has before. In time, your newly reborn empire will rule over a portion of my kingdom as my vassal, and I will make you their leader to rule them as you please." The prophet grinned in devilish delight. "The Varnock deserve a greater place in the galaxy. We will be honored to serve you, and raise our name above all other races, save only for your own, of course." The man gave a dark, sinister laugh. "Then begin the next part of my plan." The prophet bowed. "As you wish, master." The prophet then turned and quickly made his way out to his ship. As he did, the man by the pool frowned darkly. "I will enjoy wiping his race from existence someday," he said quietly. Another man, in a simple blue toga, appeared from the shadows. "Are you sure you will not betray us?" he asked. The first man grinned slyly. "His greed is too strong. He knows we are his only avenue to power. Thus, he will not betray us until we have given him all that he desires. However, I plan to ensure that he dies long before then." The second man nodded. "Understood, master," he replied. The first man then stood quietly for several moments as he pondered his next move. After a bit he turned and looked at the second man. "Is our next pawn ready?" he asked. The man in the blue toga bowed slightly. "The Varnock Admiral is ours to command. He merely awaits your orders. Then brief him on what he must do. I want him ready to fly at a moment's notice." "And what of the Gaelic Von fleet? Won't they interfere with our plans?" The man in the black cloak grinned. "I'm hoping they will." Phailan Renwald, the chief ambassador of Seoul to the UGW, stood in his office in the west wing of the ambassadorial towers in the center of Cebius, the governmental home world of the United Galactic Worlds, and stared out across the city. In a big city it was, covering nearly the entire planet from pole to pole and most of its circumference. But, despite being the capital of the UGW, Cebius was more a prime location for back-alley deals than any real productive politics. This was because the governing body of the UGW was mostly a formality these days rather than a real political power. In the past it had once been the respected center of the galaxy, using its impressive influence to ensure peace and prosperity throughout its entire jurisdiction. In many ways, Phailan longed for a return to those days of glory. But instead, he now found it to be an organization replete with corrupt politicians and diplomats, each of whom was more interested in the gross acquisition of money and power than the well-being of others, including their own people. In many ways they reminded him of the politicians back home on Earth, only uglier. However, there were still some within the governing Senate who were truthful and upright, even though they were few in number. Several of them were even his friends. Phailan sighed as he watched two large Indian transports rise up from the docking bays below him as they attempted to merge into one of the nearby transport routes that zigzagged back and forth across the planet. He missed Seoul. He tried as much as he could to visit Earth, but quite often work prevented him from doing so. As he thought about this, the sound of data pads crashing to the floor echoed from the other room. He pursed his lips incredulously and sighed. "Julius, what are you doing?" he asked with a hint of frustration. A young man in his early 20s stepped around the corner, awkwardly cradling a small pile of data pads in his hands. "Sorry, Ambassador. I was just trying to organize your quarterly reports and Senate notes, and accidentally dropped some of them." Phailan rubbed his forehead in frustration. "Ugh, Nordum must hate me. Why else would he stick me with someone like him? It has to be punishment for something I did," he thought. He sighed again, turned and walked into the next room. As he strolled past his secretary's desk, he said, "Mary, I'm going for a walk. If anyone calls, just calm me." "Will do, sir," said the young woman. "And make sure Julius doesn't destroy anything while I'm gone." The woman grinned. "I'll do my best, sir." Phailan then strode out into the hallway and began walking towards the senatorial gardens. This was a lavish wildlife complex that lay at the center of the ambassadorial towers, which contained a collection of alien plants and animals of every shape, size and color from across the galaxy, including several small rodent species and a number of birds as well. As he passed by a window overlooking the gardens, a group of Jika birds flew by the window and then swept gracefully above the densely packed islands of trees spread out across the massive arboretum. Of all the trees located there, the ones that interested him most were the Jubaea trees from the Yendian homeworld of Dotus. He marveled at how they flowered nearly year-round and never seemed to stop blooming. In the 16 years he'd been serving as the ambassador for Seoul, it still amazed him that he could look at such strange alien vegetation and find it, in many ways, to be even more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen on Earth. Even so, despite his age and years of separation, his love for his homeworld had never waned. "Great currents lift you up, Wingsanga," came a voice from behind him. He turned curiously to see a large bird-like creature standing behind him. It was dressed in a very colorful, elaborate cloak and neck dress, and appeared to be something of a cross between an ostrich and a duck. This strange avian creature was known all across the galaxy as a Gfandona, a minor race of avianoids first discovered by the Gaekvon several millennia earlier. It was also the Gaekvon who'd given them their distinctive name. While the Gfandona called themselves by a different name, most others preferred to use the Gaekvon name for them, as the Fondo language was unpronounceable by most species in the galaxy. So, due to these difficulties, the Gfandona had quietly settled for being addressed in ways other than what they were used to. Some races had even begun to simply call them Fondos out of pure verbal laziness. However, for this one particular Fondo, Phylan chose to address him as his friend. And dear friends they were. As he studied the colorfully dressed Gfandona ambassador standing in front of him, Phylan smiled at him, and bowed slightly. "Good afternoon, Finch. How are you today?" he said. The Fondo chirped happily. While Finch wasn't his real name, he'd come to accept it as just another of the many substitute names given to him by the other ambassadors. "I am on high currents," he replied. Phylan grinned. This was yet another of the many unique colloquialisms that Finch, and most other Fondos, used regularly, and they always made him smile. Just then he took notice of something. He pointed towards his own ear, and said, "I noticed you're wearing a translator. Have you given up on learning English?" Finch shook his head, and adjusted the small universal translation device that rested over one side of his head. "I have not given up, as I desperately wish to learn your language due to its simplicity and verbal beauty," he said as the clicks, whirs, and chirps of his native language were replaced with fluent English by the device. "Then why the translator?" asked Phylan. "I was on diplomatic errands today. There were too many species with which I had to gallo to bother with speaking to each in his own native beak. Thus I required this today," he said, pointing at the device. Phylan smiled. "I can relate to that. It's a bit challenging even for me to deal with it all. To be honest, most days I'd be completely lost without my own translator." Finch nodded. "Indeed. Although I wish such were not true." He then watched as Phylan sighed and soon turned his attention back to the gardens. Seeing this, it didn't take any words for Finch to realize what was on his friend's mind. "Do you wish to soar with your flock again?" he asked. Phylan smiled as he thought about his home. "I do miss Earth ever so desperately. I will admit that. But I have so much work to do out here. As much as my heart calls me home, I can't leave." Just then his communicator chirped. He pressed his ear, and said, "Phylan here." "Sir, one of the Ahaktak ambassadors is here to see you," came Mary's voice. Phylan pursed his lips in frustration. "Speaking of work, some just showed up at my door," he muttered. He bowed slightly, and said, "If you will excuse me, I have some visitors to attend to." Finch bobbed his head, and then flared out his wings in a gesture of courtesy. "May the winds forever lift you up," he replied. "And may your feathers grow ever thicker, Wingsanga," replied Phylan with a smile. This made Finch smile gleefully. Phylan then turned and hurried back to his offices located in the humanoid quarter, an area within the main complex designed to house all humanoid ambassadors. There were other quarters within the complex that similarly catered to the needs of the other biotypes as well, including aquanoids, avianoids and reptoids. It was in the middle of this menagerie of life forms that Phylan found his office. This fact was vividly apparent as he turned down the hallway towards his office and noticed two short humanoids, almost like midgets in size, studying a clump of wiring that had spilled out of an access panel in front of them. The wiring glowed and pulsed in a soft, elegant purple color in a rhythm almost like that of a heartbeat. Around their waists and over their shoulders were large, complex tool belts covered in devices of every shape and type imaginable. He soon reached his office and placed his hand on an access control pad next to the door. After a few seconds the door chirped and then slid open, after which he quickly entered and walked over to a side room just as Julius entered. "Sir, the Ahaktak ambassador is in your waiting room." He told us that he wants to discuss something very important with you, he said with a hint of nervousness. Yeah, I know. So what does that walking throw rug want now? He mentioned something about raw metals, sir. Raw metals? Oh, for crying out loud. I told him I don't want his ores. We've got enough of our own. I want some of his technology. That's all we're really interested in. Shall I send him away? Nah, let me handle that. Maybe I can finally get it through that thick furry skull of his that we're not interested, muttered Phyland. He then sighed. And before I go in, is there anything else I should know about? Mary nodded. There's 4 messages waiting for you from various ambassadors who'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience, she said. Anything specific? Asked Phyland curiously. She shook her head. Not that I'm aware of. Then put them on the calendar somewhere, and get me a list of what they want to discuss. Hopefully they won't interfere with my brown-nosing of the Varnock, he said with a hint of frustration. Brown-nosing the Varnock? I thought they hated us, said Julius. They do. That's why I want to talk to them. I'm hoping to find a way to get them to lay off us. If I can, that'll be 1 less of the 9 who want us dead. And, even if I can't, it might give Nordum some time to cook up a more permanent solution. Why the Chancellor? I mean, our Chancellor, asked Julius. Because, he knows more about the whole situation than I do. Which is ironic given that I'm here and he's there. You'd figure I'd be able to squeeze more information out of the hooligans here than he could. But, apparently not. How is that possible? Phyland pursed his lips. If I find that out, I'll tell you. All I know is that he's ahead of me on the information curve right now and I don't like it. Well, I could do some snooping and find out some stuff for you, said Julius. No. 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 The last thing I need is for you to end up getting vaporized because you did something stupid again. And don't say you wouldn't, because I know you would. Just leave this to me and you do as you're told. In the meantime, I want you to contact Nordum and schedule a meeting over secure hyperband for 14:30 hours Seoul time. Got it? Barked Phyland. Yes, sir. Phyland muttered to himself. Somehow I don't think you do, he thought. Well, onward to my meeting with Mr. Yeti and company, he quipped.